Hello, everyone. You guys doing well today? So, I was trying to be positive this morning because, try to exude positivity and have good days. And so I said, this day is going to be a good day. And I immediately banged my head against the door. And so it's Wednesday. So, that's, I immediately went back to my self-loathing and my routine and just kind of like, Wednesday, I shouldn't say self-loathing. That implies something really small. That's not where I was. This is supposed to be a humorous anecdote, and I made it unhumorous, and I apologize for it. I will do better. I will do better in the future. So we've got some control stuff to talk about today, and I need to pull up some information so that I can actually talk knowledgeably about the detail that we're going to be talking. We're going to be playing too. Interesting stuff to discuss, but real quick, I want to talk about syllabus because I made some changes to it. And so these changes I think that you'll appreciate because this is actually going to reduce some of the work that you would have to do in the future. So just for context, and some people are already privy to this information, but want to make sure that everybody is familiar with that. We have basically 3 more weeks of just kind of day in, day out work for coming up, and then week 8, we got midterm break. After week 8, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity for week 7, 8, and 9. So that's something to look forward to. Week 8, we're going to do our cybersecurity case study, which is the target data breach. And then immediately after that, we're going to have a skip a class meeting. And the reason for that is that we actually have an FBLA, Future Business Leaders America visit on that day. And the students that are coming to visit for that day, they take up a lot of the time. And in the past, I volunteered for it, and other people have volunteered for it, including graduate students. We weren't able to do it last year because I didn't have much notice. And I said, I promised Dr. Caden, I said, if you give me sufficient notice, that I will get you all the graduate students you need. Okay, because there's always graduate students that are looking to volunteer, and more importantly, there's GTRAs looking for hours. So that was kind of the goal. And so I said, we're going to cancel that class. You may also get, for those of you in business analytics right before this, may actually get that class canceled too. I can't promise that. Okay, I don't want to get your hopes up, but I informed Dr. Lee that I'm going to be doing that. But if you do get that class cancellation, I encourage you to volunteer to help out for a JBLA on that day. So we need all the bodies we can get to kind of control the massive throng of high school students that will be here. So that's going to be the first one. We'll follow that up with our normal class meeting. We will not have a quiz. So that's actually going to be like a quiz, like a 3-week gap between quiz 5 and quiz 6, which I know it's a lot. I'll try to make it up to you. I promise I will not be asked too detailed a question since there's going to be a lot of content in that time frame, but it's something to keep in mind. Other one that I wanted to mention, and these are still tentative, by the way. I think it's largely likely that this will happen. Moving to weeks 13 and 14. Originally, we were going to have quiz number 10 during this week, but one of the quizzes got canceled. And we're going to have some information going on, some stuff going on Friday, week 13. We should have some advisory board speakers. So the Department of Business and Economics and Accounting is going to actually have advisory board visiting that during that week. And Dr. Caden has offered to professionals to come talk to our class. And I thought that would be a great opportunity to talk to people in practice about the effects of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence on our profession. So I've made a specific request for that. We'll see if that happens. I will change the schedule again if it doesn't turn out, but I think it's likely that it will. So we'll have presenters that day, and I'll give you more details so we get to that. You will notice that I shifted this to quiz 9, and that's the only thing that's on the Friday before Thanksgiving. This was originally an open class, which my policy on open classes is that I don't have class right before Thanksgiving break, assuming all the students are in good behavior. But so far, you've been good. There's a few of you I got my eye on. A few of you. I'm not going to mention any names, but it's Kyle. No, like that, I say I'm not going to mention any names, then I mention a name. Yeah. All right. So, we're going to have a quiz. That quiz, I'm going to make it so that you can take the quiz wherever you're at. So it's going to be the same time you take the quiz, and the availability will be fairly open. but you're going to take the quiz. You do not need to be here in this classroom. If you're here because Dr. Lee has class and you want to join me for that quiz, that's great. But if you just want to take it from somewhere else, that's fine too. But I still wanted to have 9 quizzes. I didn't want to cancel 2 quizzes in the course, since that's what I'm doing. All right, so those are the changes to the schedule that's been uploaded to Space. So that's what we're having moving forward. This may change again, but I'll keep you updated if there are changes. All right, so with that, we're going to be talking about the data breach at TJX today. And this is actually, we're going to talk about a couple things. Kind of a follow-up with the testing controls case, which is a little bit easier. This is kind of a challenge for me, this particular topic, because I really wanted to have something that was kind of in the middle of these 2 cases. I really like the hands-on experience of the testing controls, the Excel spreadsheets, but it was just so easy. I mean, it wasn't really all that hard to figure out what was going on there. And now, that being said, I realize that I'm talking from somebody who teaches a bunch of very talented students, and we're all very knowledgeable about Excel and certain routines. This may have been more challenging for other classes, particularly if we're talking about lower level classes, but that was too easy. Whereas the first case, the breach of TJX, I think it's an excellent case. There's a lot of good information there, but I really do not like the way the cases are written in this vein, where they basically say, hey, here's the information of the case, here's a framework, regurgitate everything you know about this. I personally think that that's an exercise in futility, that's an exercise in frustration, because basically you're never going to get the kind of response that you want. Hence the reason for the instructions, I specifically said you only have to give 1 example for each one of these. Because if I said, provide all the examples you can think of related to the case, I could see that affecting my evaluations at the end of the year. Yeah, I joke about that, but it really would not be a fun exercise, it would not be a fun activity, and wouldn't get much out of it. So I would rather talk about the low-hanging fruit than no fruit at all, I suppose. Anyway, what is going on with this particular company? So TJX, you've probably not heard of the company term before, but you're probably still familiar with a little bit of their operations. They are the parent company for at least 2 companies I know. I think they had a list of a long list of the companies in the case, but the 2 that really jump out to me are TJ Maxx and Marshalls, and those are the 2 that jump out. My sister-in-law is a big fan of both of those stores. She likes low discount places, and she just likes doing a lot of shopping. And so I say that's kind of the relationship I have with those organizations, is that whenever she's like saying, hey, we should get you some new clothes, and she kind of bullies me over to TJ Maxx or Marshalls, or there's another place. I can't remember the name of it. I know I'm going down a rabbit hole that I shouldn't go down. So that's kind of the corporate lineup, and I'd say that that's kind of consistent with the way that the corporate philosophy works, is that kind of business model. And this case is a little bit old. It's almost 20 years old, but it does have some information that's fairly relevant. So let's go ahead and talk about a few things to frame the case. First of all, we're dealing with older versions of both COSO and COBIT. I think the COSO framework that we're dealing with was in 1992, and then the COBIT framework was COBIT, I don't remember, it was an older version. There were some changes in the COBIT framework. Back then, they only had four components. We currently have 5, and I said that was conceptually similar, and it is. Actually, one of the components is just repeated in the new version, so I didn't think it was really necessary to actually frame it with the new components. Interesting thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about kind of the technology concerns, which obviously 18 years, a lot has changed, but it's not as much as you might think. There's still a lot of the security concerns and protocols that we would have in place. One of the snarky comments that I always think about is, well, this is 20 years ago, Dr. Barnes, did the internet even exist back then? And I said, yes, it existed back then. We were just getting off of dial-up, admittedly, okay? Back before many of you were born, when we had to get on the internet, you had to actually pick up a phone, a landline phone. You had to make a phone call, and your computer would connect that way. And you've probably heard the noise memes, like it's got a screeching sound in the background. That's actually what it sounded like. That's not something they made up. That's actually what it was like to experience, to connect to the internet. But this is more of a dedicated internet connection, and so there were certain protocols that were in place that were very relevant to this particular case. So going into the detail of the case, I want you to read about it, and I want you to learn a little bit about it. And there was talking about the fraud. So the nature of the fraud was pretty straightforward. When we talk about the case, is that this is basically just an access of the wireless network. I should say this is one of the components of fraud, access to the wireless network. So they had certain protocols they were supposed to meet in place with respect to their security, and they were lacking on that security protocol. And that one of the big ones that they talked about is they talked about wireless equivalency privacy, or WEP. Now, it's important to note this is kind of an early schematic, an early way that the systems would operate, but this was still considered to be outdated at the time, the wireless equivalency privacy. Now, I did a little bit of research. This is a kind of a site I like to go to. I said, okay, so what are these Wi-Fi protected access items? And so this is the one they're talking about in the case, the wired equivalency privacy, or we have wired equivalency pricing. And this is effectively a outdated cipher that's fairly easy to hack. And they said that this has been not even really been in use since the early 2000s. This was kind of for early wireless networks that this was set up for. It's supposed to provide the same security as if you had a wired connection, but a wired connection doesn't really provide that much additional security, so it's not that high a bar to cross. This was what they were talking about in the case that they needed to actually meet. And today, that's outdated as well. Wi-Fi protected access, that was what the security level that TJ Maxx should have been at, and they were not. And currently, now we have WPA2 and WPA3, which are just advanced versions of those that have better encryption. And so this is kind of a guideline, and should we be using those? As a dedicated no on first of these two. This is kind of where we were at back in 2006, where they should have been, because that was the highest level existent. And why is that a problem? Well, they were communicating information across an unsecured wireless access wireless system, wireless network that contained customer credit card information. And so just imagine, so it was a little bit more difficult, but I want to use this kind of as a concept, okay? Just to kind of show you what the problem with this is. Now, this analogy is not perfect, but imagine that you're sitting in some place and you're just kind of like, I'd like to use my phone, but you can't get a good phone connection. So you're just kind of like, okay, let's see if there's any wireless networks nearby. And you see there's a wireless network that does not have a security on it. It's like, oh, great, I can use that wireless network. Then all of a sudden you have access to all the information that's flowing through that wireless network. Now, again, not a perfect analogy because we didn't have the smartphones, at least not the way that we currently have smartphones that connect that way that easily. But having a unprotected network where anybody can just connect in if they're within range of it is certainly problematic. And the way that they described the network that was when it was ranged is that the network they were just outside of the headquarters, kind of leeching off the network. So certainly problematic in that regard. There was also another issue that they identified within the case, and they talked about the kiosks. And this is something, it's a little bit, it becomes increasingly hard and more difficult to talk about with respect to the kiosks. But if you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, when people were trying to employ for positions, they would say, can I talk to a manager, get an application, fill out a paper application? And then in the 90s, they said, you know what, we've got technology, let's let that work for us. So technologies were done by computer. And you would walk into like a department store, and basically the customer service kiosk also doubled as an employment kiosk. And so they had all these places where you could go to, and you could just type in your information if you wanted to pick up an order on layaway, if you wanted to apply for a position at the store, if you wanted to get any other kind of information they could convey for that. That was kind of the early versions of that. Now, they've kind of done away with that. Those are no longer in place in stores simply because we don't need those anymore. We've got the internet and people can actually access that information much more easily. But that was their solution, and these were still in place in this in the TJX stores in 2006. The kiosks themselves are not the problem. What was the problem in the case they talked about with these kiosks? So it was access to the kiosk. How were people accessing the kiosks? Yeah, stuck a thumb drive. They were accessing the USB ports. Okay. So again, the jump drives were fairly new, but this did exist back then. This was portable storage that people could put in. More importantly, it's not even just storage, but the storage could actually be programs that could be implemented to capture information within or put programs onto the computer. And that's effectively what they did, is they put the thumb drive in, it executed a malicious code, and then allowed them to get access to the system to read details within the system, the TJX system. Now, there's a few things that we can talk about with respect to security. These are pretty low-hanging items that we can talk about. This is very easy identification, but it's important to note what the particular issues were in this case. So after reading through the case, I wanted you to think about how we are going to approach this, both from a COSO perspective and a covert perspective. Now, let's go ahead and set the stage before we get too much into this, before we get too much into detail about why this is so important. So, and I'm going to flip these. So, okay. Let's see if I did this right. Oops. Nope, that didn't work. I'm wasting your time by rotating the screen. Good. All right, so I thought I had to rotate it. So I asked you to do some analysis according to COSO and according to COVID. Now, the COSO framework is exactly identical to what we're familiar with. 5 components of the COSO internal control integrated framework. That being said, there's an important distinction to make before we start talking about COVID. When we talk about COSO, what was our conclusion, our takeaway when we talked about it last week with respect to how much it covers? Is it a little bit or is it covered a lot? A lot. In fact, well beyond the scope of just IT controls. So when we talk about COSO, we are talking about an incident specifically related to an IT controls breach, but COSO itself is not isolated to IT controls. So the answers to this could be pretty broad. It could just be an area of concern that is more broad about the controls in place at TJX in general, or it could be something that's isolated to the particular incident in question. But let's go ahead, and what I want to do is I want to go through, and I'm just going to do a few of these for each of these. I'm not going to go for every group to provide an answer because I'm sure there's some overlap. But once I get prepared here, I've got like a million windows and a million items open in place, and I'm losing it. Doesn't help that I banged my head this morning. Yeah. I said that because I want your sympathy. All right. Hold on a second. I think is group one, is Tyler in group one?
Yeah.
Okay, so at least I remembered that. Okay. So Tyler, what'd your group say on control environment? So keep in mind, we talk about the control environment, or we talk about each of these components. We're analyzing not just threats, but also strengths. There's a lot of opportunities in both areas, or a lot of items in both areas that we can consider here. So those are all possibilities. You didn't have to just simply identify threats with this. So what did your group identify, Tyler?
For the issues?
For control environment, specifically for a control issue that you wanted to talk about.
We just went with TJ Maxx. They had a board of control, board of directors, information technology.
So you just used what was on the
we just skipped that one.
I'm a little bit I'm conflicted on this one because on one hand I'm just kind of like, oh come on, that was given. On the other hand, that's just being efficient right there, you know. So all right, well if that's the case, let's see. Matt, did your group have a different one or did you use the same one?
I mean, we said upper level management was not actively monitoring for data breaches because it took them 18 months to discover the breach.
Okay, so it's an interesting point. So that's at least an interesting conclusion. So let's go ahead and let's break this down a little bit because control environment, we know, is the tone at the top, the people who are in charge of the organization and with respect to controls. Now, I'm going to ask you 2 separate questions, and they're not going to seem like 2 separate questions until I clarify. So I'm going to clarify at the beginning. When I say control environment, with respect to controls just in general at TJX, would you say they have a strong or a weak control environment? And I'm not asking any one of these 2. I'm asking just a general consensus on this. I'm not afraid to make you raise hands if people don't want to say. So how many people think they had a strong control environment with respect to controls in general? Yeah, how many people think it was weak? Yeah, I think it was strong, okay, and I'm right, all right. It actually alludes to it in the case. It talks about their control environment actually is pretty darn good. But that's not what the crux of the case is. The crux of the case has to deal more with IT controls. Now I'm going to ask you the same question. With respect to IT controls, do you think their control environment was strong or weak? How many people think strong? How many people think weak? That's where your hand should come up. Yeah, okay. So good control environment, strong corporate culture. They took a very serious approach to controls, but it doesn't appear that they were very well ingrained with respect to what they needed to know with IT controls. How do we know this? Well, obviously we see the incidents and we see the problems to follow up, but there was a lot of concern about controls in general, but not really this specific application. Now, this leads to an interesting conclusion. Do you think this is because of a lack of interest or a lack of knowledge? So control environment is basically saying that we're taking this seriously. And if you don't know something, is that something that you really just kind of like, well, I don't know this, so I want to learn all about it, and I want to make sure that I have as much knowledge as I can. Is that how you approach every single thing in your life? Probably not. There's certain things you're just kind of like, you know what? No, my area of expertise, I'm going to let somebody else do it. And kind of felt like that's kind of the approach to IT with respect to TJX, is that they said, this is somebody else's problem, and everybody was saying this is somebody else's problem. And so they didn't really have as an effective control environment with respect to IT controls. So that's kind of what the conclusion is saying there. There's a lot of different things that we could talk about, but overall, with respect to the focus on the controls is controls in place at TJX. Just looking through the solutions when I read through this, they basically talked about the code of conduct, the activity of the board of directors, the audit committee. All of these represented strengths at TJX. It was kind of the technology issues where they had the biggest weaknesses. And that's kind of where the big problem that we ran into. All right, so let's move on to risk assessment. So, and my phone stopped again. All right, so Dottie, your group is up. What did your group identify with respect to an issue related to risk assessment?
We said it seemed like the company didn't have a very good risk assessment procedure prior to the breach.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's probably a good assessment, no pun intended, of that particular issue is that they weren't really properly able to identify risks, particularly with respect to the ones related to IT governance, as a fact that they had not identified these areas as risks. Matt F., do you have anything to add on to that?
The risk assessment, no, we just kind of said that they did say that there were some risks related to IT controls, but they just didn't assess them very high because their controls in that area were lacking. But they found out that, yeah, this is an issue. They just didn't, I guess, give it the right level of weight, give it enough weight.
So let's go ahead and this is going to lead to some answers to the next few questions, but let's talk about some of the biggest keys that kind of identify that they were not taking risks seriously with respect to technology governance. So we said there were basically 2 points of breach. There's the wireless network breach, and there was the kiosk breach. What's something we can identify with respect to the wireless network that indicates that they did not do a thorough risk assessment?
Updated security protocols.
Updated security protocols. Yes, they were using wired equivalency privacy rather than a more updated protocol. Okay. Now, with respect to the kiosk, what's one that we can identify? Open USB drives. Yeah. By the way, is it possible to deactivate USB drives on a computer? You just like saying, Dr. Barnes, what are they supposed to do? I mean, USB drives, anybody can access them. Is it possible to do that? Everybody do a web search right now and say, can I deactivate a USB drive? And answer that question for me. I already know the answer to it. I've done this search before. AJ's pretty confident. He's pretty said, yeah, you wouldn't ask this question if that were the case. Yes, you can deactivate USB drives. Which leads to an interesting point a little bit later on about what that might mean for respect to the operations. So the fact that this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the fact that we actually are looking back in time, we can say, all right, they were not taking risk assessment seriously because obviously something bad happened. But we can identify specific points where they should have been identifying more risks. And these were risks that were prominent at the time, very, very easily identifiable. So it's not like we had to dig really deeply to identify issues. There is apparently a music class of some type down the hall, and this was going on Monday. I was like, what the heck's going on? I'm kind of torn because I want to close the door so that everybody focuses on what I have to say. But on the other hand, it's good to have accompaniment to when I'm talking. So, all right, so let's move on. Control activities, the controls themselves. Okay, so this is obviously something that we're going to be very concerned about. But with respect to control activities, sorry, my solution notes just all of a sudden just went crazy. All right, I'm going to do without them then. All right. What are some control activities where we can say were issues within the organization? AJ, what do you think?
We didn't name an issue, but I guess an issue is that they didn't have, like, they implemented a special help link to upload like updated information on the data breach, and like not having that before, I guess that's an issue. They should have already had it.
Yeah, so I think that we can make an argument, because remember last week we talked about controls being mostly preventative in nature, but can we make an argument that the helpline is a control, but it's more of a corrective control? Yeah, so I would buy into that. I would say it's a corrective control, and so I still think it's a legitimate argument. We tend to isolate and focus on the preventive controls, but that's an interesting point, and I do want to come back to that because I think that that's an interesting conclusion when we talk about what their response was. Okay, so what about other control activities? Who's up next? Brock, what does your group say? Jason can't handle it.
I said that they had an agreement with Visa to
All right, so they did have good corrective controls in place. So the problem came up, and they corrected the issue, and that was that. So I think that's actually a good point to make about this particular case, is that with respect to their operations, when there was a problem, that they addressed it. And it's going to allude to a little bit more when we talk about information and communication. But for the most part, we can say the preventive controls were a little bit lacking. But because they have a strong control environment, when they found out there was a problem, they did try to correct the problem, and they were able to detect the problem and correct it. Now, I'm using detective and corrective, putting those together because usually those are used jointly. The detective controls, when we say the detective controls are strong or a little bit lacking? Lacking, because this fraud went on for about how long? 18 months? Yeah, so that's a little bit concerning. Now, let's go ahead and move on to some interesting stuff with respect to information and communication. So, Megan, what's your group identify here? Yes. So yeah, I'm going to focus on that one. I'm not going to ask another group because I'm going to stay right here because I want to talk about this particular issue. They were very open and communicative, and they did try to remediate this particular problem. Now, there's two interesting takeaways that we can have with respect to this. The first of all is the communication that took place. Were you all satisfied with the nature of the communication in response to the data breach? I mean, eventually, yes, I think we can eventually say that that was the case. Now, did anybody have a problem with the time that it took them to actually issue the response? So they found the breach at the beginning of December, and they issued the statement about the breach shortly after Christmas. Does anybody have a problem with that? What was the data breach about? The data breach was about credit card information, right? Okay. If you're a customer, if you're a consumer, would you want to know if your credit card information had been breached right around Christmas time, when you're going to be exposing it to potential data breach or potential data issues? That would be something I'd want to know about right around that period of time, because that's when you're most likely or very highly likely to be using that detail. So now the counter argument to that is that they wanted to know the extent of the data breach, so they didn't want to disclose it early. And that creates an interesting problem because what is the correct answer here? When do they want to disclose? Do they want to disclose early and let people know as soon as possible? Or do they want to disclose late and make sure they have the full extent of the issue known? There's not really a good answer to that, because if you wait, then people are going to say, why didn't you let me know sooner? And if you say it early, it says, you may not have all the information you need to answer questions appropriately. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. The other scenario, and this is going to kind of leak into monitoring, so we'll talk about these kind of jointly. We know that this was kind of a corrective mechanism. We know that this is basically detecting what's going on, and they were correcting the problem. Should this have been an insight for other organizations? Should this have been something that other organizations took seriously? So this is a burgeoning area where we're starting to see technology is kind of very, very effusive within the organizations, and people can access our technology. If we don't have proper controls in place, they can access our systems. And we're going to see in a few weeks this happen in another big company, and we're going to talk a lot about a few more that happened. So certainly problematic, and it's kind of proliferated over time. Should this have been a wake-up call in 2006? Companies say, hey, take this security seriously. Yes. You'll notice I said, should this have been a wake-up call? Was it a wake-up call for most of these organizations? It was not. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you, when you see this, you're a CEO for a company that's in the same line. Like, say, for example, I'm going to use Target because Target's going to be another target of our ire, no pun intended. Pun kind of intended. It's going to be an object of our ire here in a little bit. So if I'm the CEO and I see this in the news, and I'm just kind of like, we got to make sure that we're on top of this. We're the same type of business as this company, and they had 94 million of their customers' data exposed. That's a number. That's an actual number I looked up. 94 million customers. I think it's like 45.7 million cards, 94 million customers, or maybe it's the other way around. No, that had to be right, because it had to be 94 million cards, 45.7 million customers, because it wouldn't make sense the other way around. So yeah. If your target is kind of like, we got to take this more seriously. Why wouldn't that be kind of the natural response here? So why didn't they? Why didn't they? Why weren't other organizations taking this more seriously? Does it have is it possible that it's hard to quantify preventive controls, preventive IT control measures? So I tell you, okay, you need to make sure that you do something, and you need to make sure that you go through the process. You got to go through multi-factor authentication. You've got to go through biometrics. You got to give a blood sample every time you log into a computer. At some point, you're just going to say, okay, the cost is way too much. And I say, how do you know? Because we can't quantify the cost of prevent, we cannot quantify the upfront cost, but we can't quantify the benefits that we're gaining. Like if I make you go through or jump through ridiculous hoops every single time that you want to log into a computer, eventually you're just gonna say, okay, I'm gonna stop doing that. I'm gonna eliminate these protocols. I'm gonna buy my own computer with no protocols whatsoever, and there's gonna be no security. And then only then we find out, oh my gosh, this was a bad idea. And that was kind of the problem we had, is that a lot of these organizations, they could not justify these upfront costs because they didn't know what benefits they were going to be able to derive from those. And so that's a big impediment when we talk about implementation, especially of really complex and expensive IT controls. We don't know what the benefits are. All right, moving forward, talk about COSO or COBIT now, okay? So the this is COSO ERM. Kobo, yeah. COBIT components. All right. So basically we're going to do kind of the same area. Now keep in mind when we talk about COBIT, we're talking more specifically about IT governance and IT controls that are in place. So even though we could identify with respect to COSO, they did have some broad strokes benefits. With respect to IT governance, I think we're going to be a little bit more scrutinous. We're going to be a little bit more, have a little bit more concerns in this area. So plan and organize, okay? We're gonna go back to the front. Tyler, what does your group say here?
GAX have violated some of the provisions to provide reasonable security of personal information in its networks, which led to intrusion. They did not plan very well. However, after the attack, they had a plan, but it was too late.
Yeah. So again, kind of the same theme here was talking is that before the fact, their prevention mechanisms were not very robust. After the fact, they did a good job of correcting the problem, but there's certainly issues in place. So, and again, we've identified a couple of important points. What was another one that, so this is not so much a point of attack, but a kind of an issue that was with respect to the transfer of information. How would we characterize the personal information? So the personal confidential information that was being on their network. Was it well encrypted? No, it was not encrypted at all, okay? So once you got access to the network, all of a sudden that information was available to anybody who wanted to actually have exposure to it. Now, again, this will be a common theme we see with some of these early attacks is that there was not this view or this need for encryption. And so basically once you pass the first hurdle, then you could the world is your oyster. You could access this information. You didn't have to go through and change any or alter any of the data or try to decrypt it. It was just given there as it stood. Keeping on that, plan and organize, Matt B, what'd your group identify here?
We said that as soon as the data breach was discovered, that a security plan was put in motion.
Okay, so kind of good praise for the after the fact controls. We do again say the prevention mechanisms are probably a little bit lacking. We've harped on that enough, but it looks like that they did cooperate and make sure that they followed up and had good policies in place afterwards. All right, what can we say about the policies that were in place or the policies that were put in place after the attack with respect to acquire and implement? Dottie, what's your group say?
Yeah, so we said that they made very rapid improvements to the IT environment after the breach.
Good. Matt F, what about your group?
More of the same. They came up with IT solutions to increase security protocols after incident, just deploying them company-wide.
Yeah. And then delivery and support. AJ, what's your group identify with respect to this particular area?
You said that they laid sufficient network access monitoring.
Okay, good. And then Brock, what about your group?
That we had information from their customers that were collected to in-store networks and then transported to central corporate networks.
Okay. So basically more about the process and the policies that were in place. And so before the fact, we can say that given everything we've talked about, there were certainly gaps and issues that we can identify here. After the fact, it appears that they've improved upon those protocols and made sure the system's more secure. Wrap up. So monitor and evaluate. So did they do an effective job in this area, Megan? What do you group think?
Yes, they increased their security and like reopen and going back, making sure it was in place once everything happened.
Good. Okay. So, all right. You go and listen to the music, Dylan? Is that what was
I did.
did it inspire you?
It did, yeah, now I'm ready to learn.
All right, fantastic, fantastic. All right, so we're inspired in multiple ways because we're inspired by the music down the hall, obviously, but we're also inspired by the fact that a company can learn from its mistakes, and it appears that they did have a good infrastructure that they followed up with. That's kind of the optimistic scenario. Again, the pessimistic scenario that we're going to find out is that this should have been kind of the starting point for a lot of change within this area. And a clarion call for other organizations, as you will. And we're going to kind of find out that other organizations kind of said, well, it's not a problem for us. We'll wait until it is a problem. And just for good advice, just in any area of your life, and this doesn't have to do specifically with IT controls, this can be any area, wait and see if there's a problem is generally a bad idea. It's like, okay, it looks like your car is having some problems. You probably should put some oil in it. No, I'll wait until see it breaks down, then I'll worry about it. Okay. Not a good idea. Okay, not a good idea. Got judged for personal circumstances right there. All right, let's go ahead and talk very quickly about these testing of controls. So I had you all do some very basic testing. I like the simplicity of this case. I don't necessarily like the simplicity of the procedures. But basically, you had a series of new hires and a series of terminated employees. And what you had to do is you had to go in and you had to make sure that anybody who was put on the new hire list was added to the systems and authorized usernames. Anybody who was removed, who was terminated, was removed from those systems. And so that was kind of the goal. Now, this is less about the controls process because this is a pretty easy control scenario to figure out. Okay, very straightforward. Now, the good news is, by the way, controls testing does not necessarily get more complex than this. We're trying to answer a yes/no question, as we've already talked about. And so we want to make sure that we understand two controls in place. The control that somebody who's added the system gets put in there, and when somebody gets removed from the system, they're no longer on the authorized usernames. So that was basically what you had to identify. What you had to do is you had to figure out what was the best method for going about this, because there were a few issues here. So the biggest issue that you had to note is that the names that were listed here are given first and last. For the names that are in the system username, the employee name is given as the full name, which, by the way, you can tell this is a simplified case. There's no way this would exist in reality. Okay, there's no way this would work in reality. There would be at least a primary key in the system or the employee usernames that would be some sort of employee identifier. So we would have a primary key that we would utilize in that scenario. But I think that the authors of this said, let's keep it simple. Let's make sure that people can do basic routines. So what's the solution to this particular problem? How would we solve this problem to make sure that we can actually match the names? Pretty simple, concatenate, okay? Or does anybody actually use the and shortcut now for their concatenates? I was telling my students in AIS the other day, I said, I used to be all in on concatenate whenever I joined two fields together. I type in concatenate, and I found out, oh, it's so much simpler to type in the ampersand. So that's just how I do that nowadays. So that was basically how we did that. And then once you do that, you just ran a lookup on there, whether that be VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, or you could even do index match if you really want to. I'm not too concerned about your ability to do those. I'm not going to walk through those simply because that's just something that I expect everybody to know how to do in this classroom. And I'm going to prove that everybody knows how to do it because we're going to have Excel 4. You're going to have to be doing all these advanced functions on your own. So that being said, I'm less concerned about that and more concerned about your findings. So let's just go ahead and let's go through each of the quarters to make sure that we have the identification. So we're trying to compare to the list in March and see the authorized user list. And easiest way to go about this is just kind of go through and match and see if there's anybody in here or that when we ran a lookup, if anybody did not appear up. So what about let's talk about the new hires. Was there anybody for the first quarter, or it was a new hire that did not appear on the system users names list? No, everybody was there. Okay, everybody was there. So we're good on that. So we can actually say Q1 of new hires were good. What about for the second quarter? Anybody, or did anybody pop up? So first of all, we have John Pence, okay, who apparently was hired back in 1014, okay, 1014, which I'm sure that's just a typo, but maybe that's something they left in there because they thought it was funny and deliberate. But John Pence is a new hire, but does not show up on the usernames list for Q2. Now, you had to do a little bit of digging. Could you find out the reason for that? What was the reason behind that?
Hired in less than a week.
Yeah, hired in less than a week, or less than 1,000 years in a week, depending on your point of view. So Yeah, but yeah, he was let go in Q2 and hired in Q2, let go in Q2, which makes sense that person would not be on the sister user anymore. So that's something that we can kind of have conjecture and figure out that that's pretty easy to answer. Aside from the fact that somehow in this system they typed in a name, and what blows my mind is I was telling you this last week is that you shouldn't be able to type in a date that's not 1900 or later, but somehow they did it. So this may be an older version of Excel, so who knows? Anyway, Q3, what about Q3? Anything that jumps out to you for Q3 on the new hires? Nope. Q4? Nope. Okay, so the new hires are pretty easy, pretty straightforward, all right? So everybody who's a new hire was added to the list, the exception being John Pence, who was presumably added to the list and eventually removed. And if we had more detail, if we actually had more detail about the system, we'd be able to see the change log and we'd be able to see that John Pence was added and then subsequently removed. But we're just looking at after the fact results here, so that's something we'd have to confirm. Imagine that you're doing the testing in this, that would be a question that you'd have to say, says, can I see where John Pence was added and then when John Pence was subsequently removed? And said, yeah, let me refer to our computer from 1014. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna let that joke go. All right, so Q1 terminated employees, do we identify any issues here? Nope, okay, so we're good here on Q1 terminated employees. All right, what about Q2 terminated employees? All right, now that's where we start running into problems, okay? So who are our Q2 terminated employees that are still on the list? So who is that? Layla and Abigail, is that right?
Abigail and Libby.
Abigail and Libby, okay. Okay. So these are two employees that were terminated and they were not removed from the they were not removed from the users list, okay? Now, this is an important point because this is actually kind of the crux of what we need to be looking at moving forward. So we know that this is a violation in Q2, but this is for an entire year's worth of data. So what is our responsibility with respect to periods moving forward? Do we just ignore Abigail and Layla? No, the instruction specifically said if those employees were not removed in the quarter that they were terminated, you had to look forward in the next quarter and see if they were removed as well. Let's just go ahead and save some time. Were they removed in Q3? No. Were they removed in Q4? No. Layla and Abigail could still be actually accessing the system 6 months after their termination and still be doing stuff in there. Probably not, but certainly a controls failure in that regard. So these are kind of our big outliers right here, these two right here. Now, ignoring Layla and Abigail, were there any other terminated employees in Q3 that we need to be aware of? No. Okay, we still have Layla and Abigail, which is certainly an oversight because they were not removed in Q2 or in Q3. You might have been able to make an argument, well, this is close to the end of the quarter, but actually that's a really bad argument because it was actually in the middle of the quarter that this took place. All right, Q4. Q4 is an interesting one. This tells a big story. Okay, so we know Abigail and Layla are still on the system at the end of Q4. Any other employees still in the system in Q4 that should have been removed? All of the above, okay? This is one of those times where all of the above is a correct answer, okay? So what appears to have happened here, this is not relevant to the case, but what appears to have happened in this scenario? Looks like there was a mass layoff, okay? Because all of these terminations occurred on the same date. And then whoever was in charge of removing these people from the system never did so. So is that going to be a risk? If you're looking for this, you're just kind of like, here's the IT control testing, and you're looking at this like, okay, there's a massive risk going on here. And why would we say that this is a bigger risk than just a normal layoff and a failure to remove, or more normal termination or failure to remove?
I've personally seen this happen. Disgruntled employees can just, if they still have access to the systems of the premises, they can just do.
Yeah. If there's a mass layoff, is there a higher likelihood for disgruntled employees? Yes, and it's highly likelihood that disgruntled employees will probably do something nefarious to the system because they're unhappy. So certainly problematic here. This is something that should have been like the moment that they were notified of the layoff, whoever the IT administrator should say, chop the access. We've got to take care of this right now. Instead, we've got a whole bunch of people who are probably not real happy with the company and still have access to the system and can make problems in there. So let's just really quick, let's talk about, we've got, what do we got here? 9 and then 2 more from previous quarter. So we've got 11 employees who should be removed from the system and have not been removed from the system. What would your next steps be if you were doing this testing, if you've identified this for the company and say, okay, how do we make sure that there's no problems? What would be your next logical step to approach this particular issue? Start scouring transactions for evidence of activity from these individuals. I think that's probably the most important thing. So we basically say, all right, let's go back to as far as late May or mid-May and see if any time after these dates right here, these two individuals had transactions. Because if they did, those are not legitimate transactions. And then do a very, very thorough analysis of anything through mid-October to see if any of these employees had transactions. That would be kind of the very first step to try to make sure that there's not any illicit activity. Regardless, if you were to try to give this, analysis a rating. So say that you're trying to say whether the controls with respect to new and terminated employees, you're trying to say these are effective or not. Would you say that they were effective in this responsibility or in this role? The person who's responsible for adding and removing employees from the access? I'm trying to say, is the control effective or not? I would say this control is completely ineffective. We tested the entire population of data and we had multiple errors. And so basically your hand that is supposed to be turning in right here is going to look like this. Test A looks fine. Test B, which is the new terminated employees, problems in all 3 quarters or 3 of the 4 quarters. So that's kind of where we're kind of concluding. All right, that does it for today. We have quiz on Friday and we'll do our second Excel assignment then too. I'll see you all then.